The rain had been a relentless, drumming companion for the last 100 miles, a silver-gray curtain that washed the world clean. It seemed fitting somehow. A fresh start. I'd finished my surgical conference in Boston a day and a half early, driven by a primal magnetic pull toward home. Toward him. Our 10th anniversary was tomorrow, and the thought of surprising Xavier, of seeing the unguarded delight on his face, was a warmth that pushed back against the sterile chill of conference halls and hotel rooms. In the passenger seat, protected by a crisp bakery box, sat a small, perfect lemon and elderflower cake. A miniature version of our wedding cake. A nostalgic, silly gesture. My hands, usually so steady under the glare of an operating lamp, trembled slightly as I killed the engine. The house stood before me, a dark stone sentinel against the bruised twilight sky. It wasn't just a house. It was my anchor, the place my parents had built, loved in, and left to me. It was the only home I had ever truly known, its foundations woven into the bedrock of my own identity. I juggled the cake, my overnight bag, and the keys, a giddy smile playing on my lips. I imagined his reaction. The initial shock, the slow-spreading grin, the way he'd pull me into his arms and bury his face in my hair, murmuring about how he couldn't stand being without me for another second. These were the moments that sustained me through grueling 20-hour shifts, through the life-and-death calculus of my profession. The front porch light was on, casting a welcoming golden pool that shattered the raindrops into 1,000 tiny diamonds. I didn't bother with the key. I rang the bell, wanting to see his face through the beveled glass. The seconds stretched. I could hear music from inside, not the soft jazz I favored, but a thrumming, bass-heavy track that seemed to vibrate through the thick oak of the door. Laughter followed, high and feminine, not a sound I recognized. Then the distinct, deeper timbre of Xavier's voice, a playful rumble. Maybe he had my sister over? No, Claire was in Seattle. The lock clicked. The door swung inward. And the world stopped. It wasn't Xavier. It was a woman younger than me by a decade, with sharp painted-on eyebrows and a cloud of dark hair. But that wasn't what made the air rush from my lungs, leaving a vacuum where my heart should be. She was wearing my mother's vintage silk robe. The one I kept wrapped in tissue paper in the back of my closet. The one I only wore on quiet, solitary mornings when I missed her most. The pale blue silk, embroidered with silver cranes, clung to her body as if it were a cheap costume. The scent that wafted from her wasn't my subtle sandalwood perfume. It was something sweet and cloying, an invasive floral that seemed to cling to the air like smoke. She looked me up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that took in my rain-dampened coat and the ridiculous cake box in my hands. A smirk played on her glossy lips. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with a boredom that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. My own voice was a stranger. This is my house." The smirk widened. She leaned against the doorframe, a picture of casual ownership. "Right. You must be Evelyn. The ex-wife who won't let go." Ex-wife. The words didn't compute. They were alien, a language from a dimension I didn't inhabit. My brain, the organ I trusted above all else, the one that could diagnose a complex aneurysm from a grainy scan, stuttered to a halt. Behind her, Xavier appeared. He was wiping his hands on a dish towel, a half-smile on his face that dissolved into a mask of pure, blood-drained shock. His eyes, the warm brown eyes I had looked into as I'd said my vows, darted between me and the woman in my mother's robe. The charm, the easy confidence that was his defining characteristic, evaporated, leaving behind something weak and cornered. "Evie," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. "What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to be home yet." The rain drummed on the porch roof, a merciless, rhythmic ticking. The cake box suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a monument to my own foolishness. The woman, Tasha, he'd called her Tasha in a drunken, admiring story once about a new hire at his firm, let out a low, theatrical sigh. "Well," she said, turning to look at Xavier with a proprietary air, "this is awkward." He didn't look at her. He couldn't take his eyes off me. He looked like a child caught with his hand in a cookie jar, a pathetic, flimsy excuse for a man. And in that single devastating moment, the love I had nurtured for a decade didn't just die. It putrefied. I looked past them into the warm light of my home. My home filled with the ghost of my parents' laughter and the echo of my own life. And I saw it for what it had become. A stage for my humiliation. Without a word, I stepped over the threshold, past the woman wearing my history and into the ruins of my life. Before we continue, please write in the comment which country you are watching this video. We love knowing where our global family is tuning in from. And if this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe. Your support helps us bring even more epic revenge tales of life. Enjoy listening. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, surgical calm descended upon me, the same preternatural focus that took over in the operating room when a patient's artery blew. Panic was a luxury. Emotion was a variable that could not be controlled. What was needed now was data. Assessment. Diagnosis. I walked past them as if they were furniture. Tasha bristled, opening her mouth to say something, but Xavier grabbed her arm, his eyes still locked on me with a desperate, pleading terror. I ignored them both. My footsteps were soundless on the Persian runner in the hall, the one my father had haggled for in a dusty Istanbul market. My gaze was a clinical scanner cataloging the violations. On the small mahogany table by the door where our wedding portrait had always sat, there was now a cheap generic print of a Parisian street scene. I glanced at the wall by the coat closet. Our photo was there, propped against the baseboard, face down like a disgraced relative at a family gathering. An afterthought. I moved into the living room. The room my mother had decorated in shades of cream and soft blue, a sanctuary of peace and light. 2 used wine glasses sat on the coffee table stained with red. A cashmere throw, a gift from me to Xavier on our 5th anniversary, was crumpled on the floor. His golf magazines were fanned out across the ottoman where my medical journals usually lay. He had reshaped my sanctuary into his lounge. My house. My family's legacy. And I'd let him treat it like a hotel room. The thrumming music was still playing from the Bluetooth speaker on the mantelpiece. With a steady hand I walked over and pressed the power button. The sudden, profound silence was more jarring than the noise had been. It amplified the sound of my own breathing, the frantic beat of Xavier's heart from across the room. "Evie, baby, let me explain," he started, his voice thick with a desperate, cloying sweetness that turned my stomach. I held up a hand, not looking at him. A gesture that said, "Be silent. The doctor is concentrating." I continued my tour. I walked up the sweeping staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth, cool wood of the banister my father had carved himself. At the top of the landing I paused. The door to my study was ajar. Inside, the leather-bound books I had collected since I was a resident were in disarray. A laptop I didn't recognize was open on my antique desk. But the final, most intimate desecration was in our bedroom. My bedroom. The air was thick with her perfume. A pair of high heels lay kicked off near the closet. On my side of the bed, on the nightstand where I kept a photo of my parents and a glass of water, sat a tube of garish red lipstick and a pack of menthol cigarettes. I opened my closet. A section had been cleared out, my clothes pushed rudely to one side to make room for a collection of cheap, brightly colored dresses and synthetic fabrics. I walked into the ensuite bathroom. On the marble countertop, my expensive face creams and serums were pushed aside to make room for her drugstore makeup. My bottle of Chanel No. 5 was half empty. She had been bathing in my life, cloaking herself in the scent of my identity. It wasn't just infidelity. That was a simple, common wound. This was an occupation. A hostile takeover. He hadn't just brought another woman into our bed. He had brought her into my life, my space, my memories. He had given her my mother's robe. He had allowed her to sleep on my pillow and use my perfume, to erase me piece by piece from the home that was the very core of my being. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. The entitlement. He lived in my house, drove a car largely paid for by my salary, enjoyed a lifestyle funded by the long, brutal hours I spent with my hands inside other people's bodies, stitching them back together. And in return he had treated my love, my trust, and my home as disposable assets. That was the diagnosis. A parasitic infection, one that had been feeding on its host for God knows how long, growing bolder and more destructive while I, the brilliant surgeon, had remained blissfully, stupidly unaware. I turned and walked back out of the bedroom. They were standing at the bottom of the stairs, a tableau of guilt and defiance. Tasha had her arms crossed, her chin jutted out, her eyes narrowed with a belligerent challenge. Xavier just looked diminished. A charming facade stripped away to reveal nothing but rot underneath. I walked down the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. My gaze was fixed on the front door. I didn't look at either of them. I felt their eyes on me, waiting for the explosion, the tears, the accusations. I gave them nothing. The silence was my shield and my scalpel. When I reached the bottom step, I turned and looked directly at Xavier. The calm in my own eyes seemed to frighten him more than any rage could have. The surgeon had taken over completely. The wife was gone. "Get out of my way," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of all emotion, as flat and sterile as a steel tray of instruments. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Wordlessly, he stepped aside. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped back out into the cleansing rain. I didn't take my bag. I didn't take my coat. I left the anniversary cake sitting on the porch like an offering to a dead god. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away, the image of my mother's silk robe on a stranger's body burned onto the back of my eyelids. The shaking didn't start until I was 3 blocks away. But it wasn't a tremor of grief. It was the vibration of an engine, long dormant, roaring to life. The world outside my car was a blur of weeping brake lights and shimmering asphalt. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wipers fought a frantic, losing battle, smearing the watercolor cityscape into abstraction. Inside, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the violent tremor in my hands, which I gripped to the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. I drove without a destination, my mind a maelstrom of images. The smirk on her face, the pale blue silk of the robe, the wedding photo face down on the floor. Each image was a separate, jagged piece of shrapnel tearing through me. The shock was beginning to recede, and in its wake was a pain so vast and hollow it threatened to consume me. It was a physical sensation, an ache that started deep in my sternum and radiated outward, making my very skin feel bruised and tender. This wasn't the sharp, clean pain of a surgical incision. This was the messy, septic agony of a festering wound. For 10 years I had built my life around a man I thought I knew. I had loved him with a quiet, steady loyalty that I believed was the bedrock of our marriage. I saw now that I hadn't been standing on rock at all. I'd been standing on a trapdoor. I finally pulled into the parking garage of a nondescript hotel near the hospital, a place of transient anonymity. I checked in under my own name, my voice steady, my movements measured. The night clerk, a tired-looking young man, didn't give me a second glance. To him, I was just another late-night arrival, another person with a story he didn't need to know. The room was sterile and impersonal. 2 queen beds, a generic painting of a seascape, the faint, chemical smell of cleaning products. It was perfect. It was a space utterly devoid of memory or meaning. I sat on the edge of the bed, the stiff corporate comforter crackling under my weight, and I stared at the blank television screen. The tears I had expected, the great heaving sobs of a betrayed wife, never came. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity began to form in the chaos of my mind, like ice forming on the surface of a turbulent lake. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant thrum, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. Something else was rising to meet it: anger. Not a hot, screaming rage, but a cold, dense and heavy fury. It was the anger of a fool who has finally seen the truth. He hadn't just cheated. He had colonized my life. He had assessed my assets, my home, my income, my stability, and leveraged them for his own pleasure and convenience. He had installed his mistress in my sanctuary, dressed her in my memories, and planned to continue living off the fruits of my labor. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was what truly staggered me. He had assumed I would be gone. He had assumed I wouldn't find out. And if I did, he probably assumed I would weep and rage, and eventually, because I was the stable, responsible one, I would find a way to accommodate the new reality. He had miscalculated. He had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my composure for passivity. He had forgotten that these hands, which were now clenched into fists in my lap, were the same hands that could hold a life steady through a 12-hour surgery. He had forgotten that my mind, the one he had so easily dismissed, was trained to see a problem, analyze its components, and excise it with absolute precision. The tumor was in my house. The diagnosis was complete. It was time to operate. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over my sister's name, my best friend's. I wanted comfort. I wanted someone to tell me I was going to be okay. But that wasn't what I needed right now. I needed an ally, not a shoulder to cry on. My finger scrolled down and stopped on a name: Lydia. My best friend since medical school who had horrified her doctor parents by pivoting to law school. She was now one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state. Our friendship was a bond of iron, forged in late-night study sessions and shared grief over lost patients. She knew me better than anyone. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. Evie? It's 2 a.m. Is everything okay? Is it a patient? No, I said, my voice as calm and even as if I were giving a pre-op consultation. It's Xavier. There was a pause and I could hear the rustle of sheets as she sat up in bed. What did he do? I didn't give her the sordid, painful details. She didn't need them yet. I gave her the objective facts. I came home early. He has another woman living in my house. Lydia swore, a sharp, violent word. Oh, Evie. I'm so sorry. Where are you? I'll come get you. I'm fine. I'm at the Marriott near the hospital. Okay, stay there. Don't go back. Don't talk to him. Just try to get some sleep and we'll figure this out in the morning. Don't do anything rash. She was in friend mode, her voice soft with concern. Lydia, I said, cutting through her comforting tone. I'm not calling for consolation. I'm calling for counsel. I need you to start working. Now. The shift in her voice was immediate. The friend receded and the lawyer emerged. Hey, what do you need? The house is mine. It was left to me in my parents' will solely in my name before we were married. I want it secured. I want him out. We can file an emergency petition. No, I interrupted. Not we. Me. Tomorrow morning I am changing the locks. I need you to tell me the precise legality of that. Given that it's your premarital sole and separate property, and he can establish residency elsewhere, you're on solid ground. But Evie, this is aggressive. He'll react badly. I'm counting on it, I said, the coldness in my own voice surprising me. Next. The joint accounts. There are 2. I want you to draft the paperwork to freeze them. My salary is the only thing that feeds them. I want his access cut off by 9 a.m. All of our joint credit cards are under my primary account. I want his cards deactivated. Immediately. Lydia was silent for a moment, the sound of furious typing in the background. Done. Consider it done. What else? The Mercedes he drives is leased in my name. I want the lease terminated or the vehicle reclaimed. Whatever is faster. Hey, Evie, slow down for a second. Are you sure you want to do all of this at once? Sometimes a more measured approach. I am calm, Lydia, I said softly, and the truth of the statement was absolute. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a terrifyingly serene sea. I am perfectly calm. I'm just debriding a wound. There was another pause. Lydia knew my language. She understood the metaphor. Debridement is the removal of dead, damaged, or infected tissue to improve the healing potential of the remaining healthy tissue. It is methodical, unflinching, and absolutely necessary. Okay, doctor, she said, her voice now a blade of pure efficiency. What's the final incision? I took a deep breath. This was the masterstroke. Xavier's job. He works for Harrison Corporation. George Harrison was a patient of mine 2 years ago. Aortic valve replacement. We've been friendly ever since. You're going to call his boss? Lydia sounded genuinely shocked. Evie, that's personal. You can't get him fired because he cheated on you. I'm not, I said. Last month when I was paying the credit card bills, I noticed some odd expenses on his corporate card. Dinners at places we never go to, weekend hotel stays listed as client entertainment. I asked him about it and he was dismissive, said it was all above board. But I've been thinking about it. Especially now. I thought of a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Maria, our housekeeper who had been with my family for 20 years, had mentioned last week, her voice carefully neutral, that she'd found receipts from a high-end jewelry store in his briefcase while tidying. Receipts that didn't match any gifts I had received. I have a legitimate concern, I continued, that he has been embezzling funds from the company. As a family friend of George Harrison, and as someone whose joint financial health could be impacted by corporate fraud, I feel I have a fiduciary and ethical duty to report my suspicions. I'd like you to be on that call with me in the morning as my legal counsel. The line was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then Lydia let out a low whistle. By God, Evie. You're not debriding a wound. You're performing an amputation. He's a cancer, Lydia, I said, looking at my reflection in the dark television screen. The woman staring back was pale and drawn, but her eyes held a light I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't happiness. It was resolve. And I am a surgeon. It's what I do. I slept for exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. When I woke it was still dark but the rain had stopped. The silence in the hotel room was absolute. I rose, showered in water that was scalding hot, and dressed in a crisp blouse and dark trousers I'd packed for the conference. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The hollows under my eyes were pronounced but my gaze was steady. The broken woman from last night was gone. In her place was Dr. Hayes. At 7 a.m. on the dot I made my first call. Citywide Locksmiths, how can I help you? My name is Dr. Evelyn Hayes, I said, my voice professionally brisk. I require an emergency lock replacement for my property at 24 Willow Creek Lane. All external doors. I need the most secure deadbolts you have. I can be there in 20 minutes. At 7:30 a.m., I was standing on my own porch as a burly man in a blue jumpsuit expertly dismantled the locks that had guarded my home my entire life. I did not look at the cake box, which was now a soggy, pathetic ruin on the porch steps. I did not allow myself to feel the phantom ache of betrayal. I focused only on the task at hand. While he worked, I sat in my car and made the second call. It was to the private banking division that handled my accounts. Good morning, this is Dr. Hayes. I'm calling to report several compromised credit cards and to place an immediate freeze on 2 joint checking accounts. I want all cards issued to Xavier Moreau on my accounts deactivated, effective immediately. The banker, accustomed to my no-nonsense tone, simply said, "Right away, doctor." A financial artery was clamped. At 8:15 a.m. with new gleaming brass locks on my doors and a set of keys that felt wonderfully, exclusively mine, I let myself into my silent house. The stale scent of her perfume hung in the air, an offensive miasma. I walked through the house and threw open every window, letting the clean, cold morning air rush in, chasing away the ghosts of the night before. I sent a concise, bullet-pointed email to Lydia. Locks changed. Accounts frozen, cards cancelled. Please initiate vehicle repossession with the leasing company. VIN is attached. Ready for the call with George Harrison when you are. Her reply came back in less than a minute. You are a terrifying force of nature. Harrison is expecting our call at 9 a.m. I'll conference you in. At 8:55 a.m. I stood in my study and looked out the window at the garden my mother had planted. The phone buzzed. It was Lydia. Ready? She asked. Ready, I replied. The line clicked and a familiar hearty voice came on. Lydia? Dr. Hayes? George Harrison here. Is everything all right? George, thank you for taking the time, I began, my voice a careful blend of concern and reluctance. I'm calling about something delicate. Lydia is on the line as my counsel because I want to make sure I'm handling this correctly. I laid it out for him not as a vengeful wife but as a concerned citizen. I spoke of my recent review of our finances, the discovery of irregularities on the corporate account Xavier managed, the large, unsubstantiated expenses at hotels and restaurants. I mentioned the receipts for luxury goods Maria had found, items I had never seen. I never once used the word affair. I never mentioned Tasha. I framed my entire discovery as a financial audit that had revealed deeply troubling signs of potential embezzlement. I felt it was my duty to bring this to your attention directly, George, I concluded. Given our friendship and the trust you've placed in both myself and, by extension, my husband. I hope to God I'm wrong, but the evidence is compelling. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. George was a shrewd, old-school businessman. He had built his empire from the ground up. He could smell a rat from a mile away. Evelyn, he finally said, his voice now cold and hard as iron. I appreciate your integrity. And your discretion. I am looking at his preliminary expense report for this quarter right now, and several of the items you've mentioned are aligning with what I see here. I will be launching an immediate and thorough internal audit. You can be assured that we will handle this decisively. I knew what that meant. In the corporate world, decisively was a euphemism for a swift, brutal, and silent execution. Xavier wouldn't be fired for infidelity. He would be terminated for gross financial misconduct. There would be no severance, no glowing recommendations. He would be lucky to escape without criminal charges. Thank you, George, I said quietly. I'm sorry to have been the bearer of this news. No, Evelyn, he said, a note of genuine sympathy in his voice. I'm the one who is sorry. We disconnected. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still in my hand. It was done. In the space of 3 hours, I had dismantled the entire infrastructure of the life he had built on my foundation. I had taken back my house, my money, my car, and I had surgically removed him from his career. There was no sense of triumph. No fist-pumping victory. There was only a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. The infection had been excised. The patient, my life, was now on the table, weak and ravaged, but finally clean. I made one last call, this time to my cousin Clara. Can you come over? I asked, my voice finally cracking with the first hint of exhaustion. I need some help changing the sheets. By late afternoon, the house was beginning to feel like mine again. Clara, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency and unspoken solidarity, had helped me strip every bed, bag up every sheet, towel, and piece of linen that might have been touched by them. We washed the laundry on the highest temperature setting, a symbolic cleansing by fire and water. She helped me pack 2 large cardboard boxes with Tasha's cheap clothes, makeup, and shoes. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by Clara's occasional, "What a pig," which was more comforting than 1,000 words of sympathy. I had just placed the boxes on the front porch, next to the ruined cake, like a final, pathetic dowry, when Xavier's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. It moved too fast, braking sharply, the tires squealing in protest. Clara put a steadying hand on my arm. "You want me to stay?" "Yes," I said. "But please don't say a word. Just be here." Xavier stormed out of the car, Tasha trailing behind him, her face a mask of furious indignation. He strode up the walkway, fumbling with his keys, his movements jerky and angry. He jammed the key into the new lock. It didn't fit. He tried again, jiggling it with increasing force, a frustrated, guttural sound rising in his throat. "What the hell?" he muttered, finally looking up at the door as if seeing it for the first time. That's when I opened it. I stood in the doorway, my posture straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. Clara stood just behind me, a silent, unmovable presence. Xavier's face cycled through a series of emotions. Confusion, anger, and then a dawning, sickening understanding. His eyes flickered from my calm face to the new, gleaming lock. "Evie? What is this? I can't get in. Did you change the locks?" he demanded, his voice laced with an incredulity that was almost comical. "Yes," I said, my tone level. "You can't do that. This is my home," he blustered. Tasha pushed past him, her face contorted in a sneer. "You can't just throw us out, you crazy bastard. We live here." "No," I said, my gaze fixed on her. "I live here. This is my house. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. And you," I said, turning my eyes to Xavier, "are a tenant whose lease has been terminated." I held up a folder Lydia had messengered over that morning. It contained a copy of the deed to the house, solely in my name, and a formally drafted notice of trespassing. "This property belongs to me and only to me," I said, my voice resonating with a calm authority that seemed to suck the air out of the porch. "You are trespassing. Your belongings," I gestured to the cardboard boxes, "are here. I suggest you take them and leave." Xavier stared at me, his mouth agape. The charming, confident man I had married was completely gone, replaced by a sputtering, impotent shell. It was in this moment that he finally seemed to understand. He wasn't just in trouble. He was erased. "Pie car," he stammered, his eyes darting to the Mercedes. "My cards. They're not working. My credit card was declined at lunch." "What did you do?" "I have secured my assets," I said simply. "The car you are driving is leased in my name. A representative from the leasing company will be here within the hour to repossess it. The bank accounts you have been drawing from are funded exclusively by my income. They are now frozen. The credit cards you have been using are supplemental to my primary account. They are now deactivated." Each sentence was a perfectly placed nail in the coffin of his life. I watched the blood drain from his face as the full scope of his predicament crashed down on him. The comfortable lifestyle, the easy money, the status. It wasn't his. It had all been mine, a loan he had mistaken for a gift. He had mocked the foundation while living in the penthouse, never realizing that I could revoke the elevator access at any time. Tasha's bravado finally cracked. The sneer was replaced by a look of wild-eyed panic. She turned on Xavier, her voice a shrill accusation. "You told me you owned this house. You told me you were a partner at the firm." Xavier ignored her, his eyes locked on me, a desperate, pathetic plea beginning to form. "Evie, please. We can talk about this. Don't do this. You're destroying my life." "No," I said, the final word on the matter. "You did that yourself. I am simply cleaning up the mess." I stepped back and began to close the door. "You have 10 minutes to load your things into a taxi I suppose, and vacate my property. If you are still here in 10 minutes, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." I closed the door on their shocked faces, the solid, satisfying click of the new deadbolt sliding into place sounding like the final note of a symphony. Through the beveled glass I watched them. Tasha began screaming at Xavier, a torrent of abuse and accusations. He just stood there, looking at the door to the life he had so carelessly thrown away, a man who had just realized far too late that the woman he thought was his safety net was actually the one holding the scissors. The months that followed were characterized by a profound and cleansing silence. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Lydia handled everything, insulating me from the messy fallout. Xavier, stripped of his resources and facing a corporate fraud investigation, didn't have the means or the will to fight. He was a king deposed, left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the consequences of his own arrogance. Lydia gave me periodic updates, delivered in her typical clinical fashion. The internal audit at Harrison Corp found extensive fraud, she told me over coffee one Saturday morning 3 months later. He was falsifying expense reports to the tune of nearly $100,000 over 2 years. Harrison is pressing charges. Xavier's facing jail time. I processed the information, feeling a distant, detached sort of pity. Not for him but for the man I once thought he was. "And the mistress?" I asked, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Tasha." Lydia snorted. "She called my office 3 times demanding her things. I told her to send a notarized list and that any items not belonging to you would be left with building security for her to pick up." Apparently, she discovered Xavier wasn't the wealthy partner he'd claimed to be. "Last I heard, she moved back in with her parents in Ohio. She left him the day after you kicked them out." "Of course she did. Theirs wasn't a romance. It was a transaction. And his currency had been revealed as counterfeit. I set about reclaiming my home not just legally but spiritually. I hired painters and had the entire interior redone in warm, calming shades of gray and green. I sold the bed we had shared and bought a new one, a beautiful 4-poster frame that felt entirely my own. I rearranged the furniture, packed away every gift he had ever given me, and donated his expensive, useless clutter to charity. Maria, my housekeeper, moved through the house with a lighter step, a quiet smile always on her face. One day, as I was arranging new books on my study shelves, she came in with a glass of iced tea. "The house feels happy again, Doctora," she said softly. "It can breathe now." I knew exactly what she meant. I could breathe now too. I filled the silence not with noise but with life. I re-enrolled in the pottery class I'd abandoned because Xavier found it messy. I started painting again, setting up my old easel by the large window in the living room that caught the morning light. I hosted dinners for my friends, filling the rooms with genuine laughter and intelligent conversation. The house, which had been a stage for betrayal, transformed back into a sanctuary, a home. My home. One evening about 6 months after that rainy night, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number but I answered anyway. "Evie." The voice was thin, reedy, stripped of all its former confidence. It was Xavier. I stood by the window, looking out at the twilight settling over my garden. I didn't say a word. "Evie, please don't hang up," he begged, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now but I need to say it. I was a fool. I was an idiot. I threw away the only good thing in my life. I lost everything." I listened to the litany of his regret, the pathetic self-serving sorrow of a man who was mourning not the loss of my love, but the loss of his comfort. He wasn't sorry for what he did, he was sorry he got caught. He was sorry for the consequences. He talked for several minutes, a rambling, desperate monologue of excuses and pleas for forgiveness. I remained silent, my breathing even, my heart rate steady. I let him pour all of his poison and pathetic justifications into the void. When he finally paused, breathless, waiting for a response, for some crumb of absolution, I gave him the only thing he now deserved from me. Silence. I pressed the red icon on the screen, ending the call. Then I blocked his number. I stood there for a moment, the phone in my hand, feeling the last frayed tether to my old life snap and wither into nothing. There was no anger, no pain. There was only peace. He was an echo from a life I no longer lived, a ghost in a house that no longer remembered his name. A year to the day. I woke not to an alarm, but to the gentle insistence of the morning sun slanting through the large bay window in my bedroom. For a moment my mind, still clouded with sleep, registered the date. The 10th anniversary. No, the 11th. A date that once held so much weight now floated by with the lightness of a stray feather. I rose and put on the pale blue silk robe, my mother's robe. I'd had it professionally cleaned twice to remove any lingering trace of her perfume, of her presence. Now when I wore it, it smelled only of lavender and cedar, of me. It felt soft and familiar against my skin, a hug from the past. Downstairs I brewed a pot of strong coffee, the rich aroma filling the quiet house. I took my favorite mug, a heavy hand-thrown ceramic piece I'd made myself in my pottery class, and carried it into the living room. I sat in the large armchair by the window, the same one Xavier and I used to fight over, the one that offered the best view of the garden. The morning mist was lifting off the lawn, and the dew on the rose petals my mother had planted decades ago sparkled like a cache of scattered diamonds. The house was serene. The air was clean. My paintings, vibrant and full of life, hung on the walls where generic prints and his pompous golf trophies had once been. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was the sound of peace, of solitude that was chosen and cherished, not inflicted. It was the sound of a life that was wholly, completely and unapologetically my own. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through me. I thought of the woman who had stood on the porch in the rain a year ago, holding a silly cake and an even sillier hope. I felt a pang of compassion for her blindness, for the devastating pain that was about to shatter her world. But I did not wish to be her again. Her breaking was what had allowed me to be built back, stronger, on a truer foundation. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need a spectacle. I only needed to remember what was mine and to have the courage to reclaim it. My house. My finances. My career. My peace. My life. A small, genuine smile touched my lips as I watched a fat robin land on the bird feeder outside. The sun was warmer now, burning through the last of the mist. The day was bright with promise. I took another sip of coffee and settled deeper into the chair, the silk of the robe cool against my skin. This house, I thought, my heart full not with the ghost of a lost love, but with the solid presence of myself. This house finally feels like mine again.